Good morning, I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's wonderful to welcome you here for today's Metro Majority Local America Conference. While based on opposite coasts, the relationship between the Pepperdine School of Public Policy and the Manhattan Institute is longstanding and wide-ranging. From our shared policy interests to a number of friendships between our two institutions, SPP alums who have worked at MI, including a current student who is serving her summer internship with you all, an honorary degree bestowed on MI's former director, Larry Mohn. I'm delighted to welcome you to this conference, a timely series of conversations about local government policymaking. Of course, the foundation for this relationship is our common respect for and work with the late great social scientist James Q. Wilson. In our 25th anniversary of the School of Public Policy, Wilson in many ways can be considered one of the founders of the School of Public Policy, having designed our unique liberal arts curriculum that balances rigorous study of history and political philosophy along with the skills of quantitative policy analysis, to prepare leaders and policymakers who can take a more well-rounded view of today's policy challenges. This perspective is one shared with our friends from the Manhattan Institute, the nation's leading local government policy research institution, but one that always balances a sense of place with their policy proposals and research. This, of course, is an important time to be exploring the policies that are made at the local level. Some of you know I didn't take the most direct route to this position as Dean of the School of Public Policy. It's a rather circuitous one that found its origins actually in Manhattan on 9/11. It was 9/11 that fundamentally changed my view of my own career and the world around me. But as a policy crisis, 9/11 shifted many of our intentions and concentrations on public policy at the federal level and international or global level. We all know the stories of people who changed careers, went into the military, got involved in the National Intelligence Service area as a way of responding to that crisis. COVID, in many ways, has fundamentally reoriented America's view of where policy is made. I was on a call several months ago with some friends back east, and as they were asking me how the state was responding to COVID, I had to remind them that it wasn't really so much that I lived in California that was important, but that I lived in Los Angeles County. Americans throughout the country are beginning to realize that much of the policy that is being made that impacts their everyday lives, from whether schools are open or closed, to whether businesses are open or closed, to various restrictions on access to public facilities, these decisions are being made at the local level. People are learning anew that we have actually an office called county supervisor, that we have county and city administrators, and that while so much of our attention from 9/11 and for the following decades has been placed on Washington, D.C. and globally, COVID has fundamentally reoriented Americans' view of where policy is made. This is what makes organizations like the Manhattan Institute so important. But of course, it's not just where policy is being made, but how it is being made. Just yesterday, I spent the entire morning in Palm Springs, a place slightly warmer and sunnier than here, with a group of 35 police officers conducting one of our training seminars for the California Police Chiefs Association around community building and public engagement. And what is evident in speaking with this group of 35 police chiefs from around the state of California is that their jobs are becoming increasingly more difficult as policy decisions and local residents are becoming much more aware of where decisions are being made. In some instances, police officers are being fielded to actually act as security for city council meetings, school board meetings, and county administrative meetings. And so the next step in this series of discussions in understanding that Americans are becoming much more aware of the importance of local level decision-making is the question of whether we're going to be able to conduct and form this policy in a way that best engages our residents, but at the same time can do it in a civil and deliberative way. Again, that's what's so important about the work of the Manhattan Institute, and also what's so important about today's conference. As you'll see in the agenda and throughout the day, it is possible to talk about very difficult, polarizing issues, from public safety to education to homelessness to housing, in a way that is civil, deliberative, and informed. And that's why it's really so great to partner with the Manhattan Institute on this important series of conversations at this time in the nation's history. And so without any further ado, to get our agenda started for the day, I welcome up my good friend, the Director of Domestic Policy for the Manhattan Institute, Michael Hendricks.
Thank you so much, Pete. Pete has been a great partner throughout this entire process, as has been Pepperdine. You talked about being civil, deliberative, informed. That's a great description of you and the entire program that Pepperdine has here. They've been a fantastic partner. Again, I'm Michael Hendricks, Senior Fellow and Director of State and Local Policy at Manhattan Institute. This is a big part of our project to reach citizens, local governments, leaders all across the country, and especially here in California. We want to thank not only Pepperdine, but you for being here, and our hundreds who are also watching now on live stream. Thank you so much for being a part of this entire program. And to our supporters, Howard Amundsen, thank you so much for making this gathering possible. National politics, they make headlines. They make headlines all the time these days, sometimes too many headlines. But it's really at the local level where we can make a difference, where a difference happens. And these local areas and the leaders there, they are truly the authors of the American project. And I say American project too, because this is a project that you lead as well here at Pepperdine, the American project. That vision could not be more crucial today. You know, mayors, council members, school board leaders, these are the people who govern where we live, where we work, where we raise kids. And given the pandemic and everything that we've learned, and as Pete laid out, local now matters more than ever. So they may not get all the headlines, but I think it's where the American project is made. I think it's where it matters. So this conference will look at the challenges. We'll also look at solutions to strengthen these local attachments that bind our nation together. We'll discuss what it means to lead local, to serve local, to solve local. And we'll hear from local leaders. We have mayors here, Mayor Johnson from Dallas. Thank you so much for being here. We have Mayor Lincoln from Stockton, Mayor Faulkner from San Diego, former Mayor Will O'Neill from Newport Beach, Mayor Mick Cornett, thank you so much, from Oklahoma City. These are just incredible local leaders, and we have a full lineup with even more. Please look in the agenda in front of you and throughout and online as well to see who not only is going to be speaking here throughout the day, but what our agenda is like. But to kick us off, I could not think of a better thinker to get us started than Ed Glaeser, the man who celebrated the triumph of the city. You have to get that book. Celebrated the triumph of the city, but now also fighting for their survival in his new book. And by the way, you haven't gotten his book, haven't read his book, you're in luck. You have a copy of his book. There's a bunch of copies there over in the corner. Please grab one. If you need more, just let me know. But he makes an argument. Please grab a copy. But cities will survive, and they will thrive if they compete. And Ed is going to show us what that means. Ed Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University and Chairman of the Econ Department at Harvard, no small matter. Previously Director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and Director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. He's published countless papers on matters of economic growth, law, economics, the cities, and growth. He's a PhD from the University of Chicago, also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And he provides the annual James Q. Wilson Lecture at the Manhattan Institute, of course, where James Q. Wilson has such a legacy here as well at Pepperdine. His new book, Survival of the City, reckons with how cities are changing in the face of existential threats the pandemic only accelerated. Ed and his co-author David Cutler, also from Harvard, argue that city life will survive, but individual cities do face terrible risks. Now, great cities always demand great management. That's also why I'm so glad we have so many of those great managers here. And the current crisis, the COVID crisis, everything that followed with it, exposed fearful gaps in the capacity for good governance, though, in many parts of America. What will distinguish the cities that flourish from the ones that won't? That's going to be the theme of what Ed will be talking about throughout. Please look in front of you. There's little question cards there. Write out your questions. Hand them to Melissa. Where's Melissa? She's right over there. Hand them to Melissa. She'll grab them. And then after Ed's done, he and I will moderate a discussion together with your questions. Without further ado, Ed, thank you so much.
Yeah, I can move, right? You can cover me for the camera. Great. I am thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be here at Pepperdine. I'm thrilled to be at another, fantastic Manhattan Institute event. And I'm thrilled to be talking about local America. One of the things that Michael just told you about me is that for 10 years I directed the Taubman Center for State and Local Government. And my job in that role was to remind all of the students at the Harvard Kennedy School, all of whom thought they wanted to be in the State Department, that actually the government that really matters, and actually the government that functions well, are America's state and local governments. That these are the ones that educate our kids and keep us safe from harm and do the things that matter most in our lives. I'm going to talk about basically three things. I'm going to start off with a little bit of perspective on how pandemics have impacted cities in the past. The basic point being that the impact of a natural disaster is always mediated, is always determined by the strength of civil society at the time in which the disaster struck. The second thing I'm going to talk about is whether or not offices, face-to-face contact, and cities themselves, how permanently are they challenged by the double whammy of COVID and Zooming to work. Third thing I'm going to talk about is winners and losers during the past 2 years across cities, and that's what those. Now I'm not going to highlight. You've each got these little handouts with these lists in front of them. This is from the paperback version of the book, which will be coming out in September. And finally, we're going to talk about policies, because really my theme is not in any sense that cities are dead. No, don't look at it yet. Pete, put it down. Put it down, Pete. But in fact, the competition for global talent has just gotten hotter. Zoom does not mean, at least I will argue that Zoom does not mean that face-to-face contact is dead, but it certainly has made it easier to relocate than ever before. And this means, in fact, the competition for global talent is just getting hotter, and that means that cities need to up their game. It's a challenging moment because we are at a very progressive moment where the urge in many places is to try and fix longstanding wrongs by taxing the rich and taxing businesses. But of course, it's never been easier for those businesses and for those rich people to leave. And that's, in fact, the challenge that all cities face. Okay, a little bit of historic perspective. Cities have done amazing things for thousands of years, but there are also demons that come with density. I can think of no better place to make that point than 5th century BC Athens, right? So this is a place which does unbelievable things in drama, in sculpture, in democracy itself, in philosophy, in mathematics. History is literally created there, right? This is where Herodotus and Thucydides actually make history. It's an economic superpower. It's a military conqueror. It's really incredible just how much strength comes from the concentrated genius. I mean, I just have this image of Socrates and Plato bickering on an Athenian street corner. It sort of says what cities can do at their best. But the very strength, the very success of Athens, excites the envy of their land-based military rival Sparta. Sparta issues a challenge. Pericles, the leader of the Athenian democracy, is no person to back down. And so the Peloponnesian War is on. Now, Pericles has a cunning plan, which is he's going to summon in the Athenians and their Attic allies behind the walls of the city, trusting those walls to keep out the Spartan warriors, the hoplites, and then send out Athens' superior sea fleet to go out and harass the Peloponnesian coastline. Perfectly sound militarily. The problem is that Athens, just like our modern cities, is a node on a global lattice of travel and trade, which makes it a port of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for viruses. And something entered into the Athenian port in 430 that ended up devastating the city. We're not exactly sure what the disease is, but Thucydides was there. He describes a city that has gone, amok, where people live only for the present because they do not expect to see tomorrow. Maybe 1/4 of the population dies over a 2-year period. That's a death rate, order of magnitude 100 times higher than COVID-19, right? And so it's just a very, very, catastrophic event. Now, it's not curtains for Athens. It soldiers on in the war for another quarter century before finally losing, but it shrinks from being perhaps the New York of the Eastern Mediterranean to maybe being the Philadelphia to maybe being the New Haven, right? That's a Harvard thing that so even, flash forward, I tell the story in the second chapter of the book of 3 more classical plagues. The Antonine Plague, which hits Rome at its strongest, this moment when Edward Gibbon says is sort of the most felicitous time in the history of mankind, right? Does nothing. I mean, kills a huge number of people, but like the good emperors charge on and it's all perfectly solid. The Cyprian Plague hits 100 years later, a little bit more chaotic, Rome starting to be in trouble, and the plague then compounds the difficulty. The most catastrophic one, and I don't have time to go through the story here, is the plague that hits Constantinople in 541 CE, which is just a devastating event, arguably leads Europe into 8 centuries of chaos, rural poverty, and death. Now, for most of the past 600 years, our cities have been more resilient to plague. And I think the best place to see this is in 19th century America. And this is really the point of the 3rd chapter of the book, where we tell the story of this moment, and it's really a local moment. Okay? It's a moment in which you have massive deaths from that early era of globalization. First, yellow fever, mosquito-borne illness, emerges out of Africa, gets carried across the Atlantic, probably in the early 18th century, then ravages the cities of the eastern seaboard in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Then, of course, you have cholera, emerges in a particularly virulent form in 1817 in the Ganges Delta, gets carried along with the British Army, gets carried along with the Tsar's army, makes its way to New York in 1831. These diseases are devastating, again, roughly order of magnitude 100 to 200 times deadlier than COVID-19 at various points in time. No, 10 to 20 times deadlier, sorry, than COVID-19. What happens is that cities and towns rally. They rally to build infrastructure that ends up making them far more resilient. Okay? And in some sense, this is the moment in which governments stop being simply agents of death. Because that's pretty much what governments did prior to 1790, is they killed people, right? Now, we may be charmed by Frederick the Great having letters back and forth with Voltaire. We may be very happy when they're killing our enemies for us, but they're basically in the death business. Then suddenly, local governments got into the life business. And it was because people, citizens, like Mayor Stephen Allen of New York, who was sort of an organizer, a friend of aqueducts. He puts together the urban alliance that builds the Croton aqueduct system. Dr. Stephen Smith, a pioneering urban doctor, figures out the sort of way that cholera is being spread, and then gets in New York. John Snow is the person who actually figures out that cholera is waterborne in London in the 1854 cholera outbreak. But Smith actually creates a political alliance that builds the Metropolitan Board of Health, and what they do is they make sure that all these tenement owners who basically didn't want to pay for access to the clean water, right? They start doing inspections and they start fining the tenement owners who don't connect, which reminds you that in many cases you need not just infrastructure, but you need incentives on top of that infrastructure. You don't just want a road, you want a road that is priced right, in terms of getting proper usage. And this is the moment in which local governments start doing this amazing thing. And you see the death rates just plummeting over the 19th century. And you go from being, cities being killing fields to places in which cities are actually often healthier than the non-urban areas, right? And in some sense, for almost 100 years, since the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, we forgot that urban density could enable spreads of diseases. We pretty much forgot the risk of pandemic more generally. And then all of a sudden, COVID-19 struck. And our world changed. And in some sense, it was much less, it was much less devastating, perhaps, because we had Zoom, but it was also weirder because we had Zoom. Okay? It was just a very strange set of events. People went home for long periods of time. They didn't do that in 1918, 1919. They actually needed to work, and they went to work even if they were going to get sick. Now, this shift to a Zoom life right, which still continues. And no part of what I'm saying suggests that I don't think hybrid has a future, and I don't think there are business conferences that won't be eliminated because of this. But how big a transformative effect will being remote have? Now, if you just look at the current data, it looks pretty big, okay? So I'll just give you two sets of data on current vacancies of offices. One is the Castle Back to Work Barometer. So the Castle operates the entry technologies for a bunch of fancy office buildings throughout the US. So what they see is basically the key fob entries, and they can tell you what occupancy is relative to the pre-pandemic. Across 10 cities, they're showing about 42% occupancy relative to pre-pandemic. So that's a 58% decline. There's variation, okay? Unsurprisingly, Dallas is at 50%, right? So Dallas is doing better in terms of people being at work. And San Francisco, which is always the nadir of these things, that's at 32%, okay? But it's a 32 to 50% range between those two, with the other cities in the middle. That data is biased towards knowledge workers, who are the ones who did the most of this stuff remotely. If you go to Google Workplace visits, which is perhaps certainly less biased, still probably somewhat biased. The US as a whole, we're down 22% in terms of workplace visits relative to pre-pandemic. So that's a lot different than a 50% decline. It's still pretty significant. There's still range across cities. Now, Dallas, that US as a whole is not just urban, that's everything. So Dallas across, I grabbed a bunch of cities. Dallas is the second lowest decline at 27%. Houston is 24%. So now, then you've also got 3 cities at 30%, so that's San Diego, Los Angeles, and Cook County, Chicago. These are all county-based data. And then you've got New York, which is 38% down, and again, San Francisco, which totally leads the pack, 49% reduction, okay, in Google Work visits in San Francisco, really off the charts in terms of people stopping to go. Now, what does that mean for the world going forward? What does that mean for cities going forward? Will our cities have acres of empty skyscraper space for decades afterwards? I think there are many reasons why that's unlikely. But let's sort of acknowledge what we know so far about the facts of working remotely. So most of the studies that we have suggest that short-term productivity for many jobs, does not go down if you're remote. So data on computer programmers from Microsoft, for example, finds that they can program just as fast when they're apart. Data on call center workers, and we had an old study by the great Nick Bloom of Stanford documenting this, and there's new work by Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington showing the same thing. The call center workers, you send them home, they're making just as many calls. And if anything, they're making slightly more calls. So sort of static productivity stays kind of constant. We saw this, in fact, in productivity numbers. I think the question for many of us is, what do we think this means for more dynamic effects? So face-to-face learning is not just about getting a job done now. It's about building skills that last for the long run. Right? It's what the great English economist was talking about, Alfred Marshall was talking about when he wrote that in dense clusters, the mysteries of the trade become no mystery but are, as it were, in the air. Right? And I think all of you, if you're honest, can think of many times in your life when just being around someone who was a mentor, who was a role model, who was something in your life, maybe it was because they screwed up, but you learned something from that. You became better, you became more productive. We're sort of, it's one of our greatest talents as a species is our ability to borrow knowledge from people around us, to be intellectual magpies. And you lose most of that when you're not in the same room. Now, the same call center worker studies that show flat productivity also shows that when you go remote, and this is pre-pandemic, this is not a particular pandemic thing, when you go remote, your probability of being promoted drops by over 50%, okay? 50%. And what does being promoted as a call center worker mean? You get to handle the really difficult calls. Doesn't that sound fun? But your wage does go up. Now, how would you learn how to handle those calls if you were all by yourself in your home? How would your boss know that you were good at handling these things, right? Being there is an opportunity to learn. I'm going to read you something from an abstract. This, again, the same people who found that in the short run, Microsoft's workers were just as productive. This is a Microsoft team, and I'll just read you from the abstract. Our results show that firm-wide remote work caused the collaboration network of workers to become more static and siloed, with fewer bridges between disparate parts. Furthermore, there was a decrease in synchronous communication and an increase in asynchronous communication. Together, these effects may make it harder for employees to acquire and share new information across the network. So it's a view that sort of the learning, the teaching nature of this job has gone down. Third fact, new hires. The work of Jose Ramon Morales Aria and, let me get their names right. Jose Ramon Morales Saria and Carlos Dabuin, looked at new hires and employment for jobs that could be done remotely and jobs that had to be done live. When the pandemic starts, both employment and new hires in jobs that had to be done live collapse. And then they come back up, both together. For the remotable jobs, employment, steady. New hires collapse and stays down for 18 months. Okay? So even though these programmers seem to be doing reasonably well in terms of their short-term productivity, right? New hires for programmers, or rather new ads on Burning Glass Technologies aggregator for programmers, drops by 42% between the start of 2020 and the end of 2020. They're just not onboarding new workers because they can't teach them the culture, because they can't build the sort of soft skills that go with working as a team. It just doesn't work. Fourth fact about the Learning Channel. We have now, and I understand that a school is not the same thing as a company, but they're not totally different, right? They have some things in common. We now have a long literature on remote schooling, and it's somewhere between being dismal and completely counterproductive, okay? It's about as useless a thing as you could possibly get, particularly with younger kids, right? And even with, our first-year graduate students last year, right? So these are smart, motivated people. It was a really, really difficult thing to get any traction going. It was a really difficult thing to build the sort of learning machine that you hope patterns. And because this sort of learning aspect is so important in economies that are built on information, that will serve as a pullback to offices, a pullback to face-to-face contact, a pullback to cities. Three other things that are important in terms of thinking about the future of remote work. First of all, when you have a decline in demand for office space, right, which I'm not doubting that this is one, right, the thing that first adjusts, or the thing that should adjust, is the price, right? And the price of these office buildings, the rents that they charge, should decline to a point in which they're filled again. Now, that may not be possible in markets that started essentially too close to the bone with office rents, like the Clevelands, the Detroits, the Buffaloes. Those may drop to a point in which they really do have vacancies. But if you're starting at $100 a square foot, or 80, or 60, fine, drop 20%. Okay? You'll get a whole bunch of businesses that used to be priced out in 2019 and will come back in. You'll have a younger, scrappier city, a younger, scrappier space, and that's not all bad. Okay? Second point, if you really imagine a world where, that is, really fully remote, this is a really awful world in terms of, American equality, right? During May 2020, at the apex of remote work, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely. Let me just get the number. 5.2% of high school dropouts were working remotely. 15.3% of Americans with high school degrees and no college were working remotely. This was a very elite phenomenon. And if it's a world in which elites just go home, it means all of the urban service economy, the 32 million Americans before COVID, the 1/5 of the American labor force that worked in leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, they're just screwed, right? Those jobs depend upon people coming in. Last point about, before I go to winners and losers, last point about cities, face-to-face contact, and so forth. The other thing that's really important in terms of driving urban space has nothing to do with productivity, just has to do with fun. We're a social species that likes being around other people. And, I had plenty of 60-year-old colleagues who said, this remote work is fine. I don't really need to come in anymore. I didn't have a single 23-year-old student who said, what I really want to do is hang out in my dark studio apartment and just dial it in. I want to be around other people who are 23. I want to be around, I want to be living a real life. And that really is an important draw for our cities. I mean, the ability of cities to attract and retain talent is about as central a role as you can. And the role of cities as places of pleasure as well as productivity is really central. Okay, so I've tried to argue that the demand for face-to-face contact, the demand for cities, even the demand for offices shouldn't be thought to disappear. That doesn't mean that Zoom is irrelevant. Okay, so while I cannot see, just have in mind a startup with 15 really smart people who are doing an amazing product, right? Really excited about it. I think there's no chance that they will all say, we're just going to go to our disparate houses in Orange County and some other place and only collect electronically. Okay, that's not what's going to happen. But they may well say, we're tired of paying Silicon Valley rents and we don't want to pay taxes, and so we're going to relocate to Austin. We're going to relocate to Vail because we like skiing. We're going to relocate to Honolulu because we like surfing. That is an eminent possibility because they can connect with their venture capitalists over Zoom. They don't need the same location. And so for that reason, right, it feels to me like we're almost replaying the 1970s. The 1970s was this perfect storm where an increased ability to leave cities, container ships, highways, suburbs, all made it possible for both firms and wealthier individuals to just decamp. That heightened mobility collided with these progressive dreams, which saw true inequities that existed in our cities and wanted to do something about it. But they did so in a way that was putting the burden on the most mobile parts of their tax base. And so that tax base disappeared, and you faced this sort of very existential threat in the 1970s. I want to make sure that doesn't happen now. Okay. Who have been the winners and losers? Now you're allowed to look at the paper, okay? Pete, go ahead. So they're ranked top to bottom. What I did for this, it's kind of I have 4 measures of urban success. Price growth, so this is real price growth, measured by the Federal Housing Finance Agency repeat sales indices. Weekly wage growth, employment growth, and the percent change in housing permits. I then take each of these measures, and you can see each one on their own, and to form an index, I divide each change by the overall standard deviation, how variable this thing is overall, to create something that's called a z-score, and then I just average across. And so it's ranked from top to bottom. So you can see the winner on this is Austin. And so my publisher, who chose the photo on the book, which is also Austin, gets a lot of kudos for sort of choosing that 18 months before this data came out. Amazing price growth, amazing wage growth, amazing employment growth, and amazing permits growth. Now should turn it over maybe? Well, Austin's the top. So if you should have Austin top, Phoenix is next. One thing that I would caution you about is this combination of 40% real price growth and a 47% permitting growth. That is awfully reminiscent of 2005 to me. 2006, and I would be a little bit worried about that, particularly in Sunbelt places, and this is not California, sadly, Sunbelt places where it's really easy to build, right? Phoenix permitted the same number of homes that they did in last year as they did in 2005, right? There's a lot of desert there. There's no meaningful barriers to building, and when Los Angelinos move out to Phoenix, they say, oh boy, it's really cheap here. I'm sure I should be paying a lot more for this house, and so the house goes up. But that doesn't recognize the tyranny that supply ultimately holds in controlling prices in an unconstrained market. Sunbelt dominates this list. This is basically the same story that we've seen in the US for the last 70 years because of both relatively pro-business policies, because of relatively pro-housing policies. And let's face it, Americans just like warmer winters. For all these reasons, the Sunbelt has done relatively well. There are some non-Sunbelt places. There's a bunch of really nice places in the West, like Salt Lake City, Denver. Then there are a couple of sort of old industrial cities, Indianapolis and Columbus, Ohio. These are very well-run places. Columbus is best seen as being the northernmost Sunbelt city rather than the southernmost Frostbelt city. And then finally, the total outlier here, Philadelphia. Philadelphia does not belong where it is. Philadelphia is where it is because of a crazy thing in its tax code that if you got in your permit, right, in 2021, right before in December, you didn't have to actually build anything. You would get this huge tax benefit. So all these developers rushed, and you can see it's all based on a 142% increase in housing permits, which is all a bunch of guys taking advantage of this. The Texas cities ended up being slightly lower on this list, not because they're not doing quite well, but because their housing markets are just saner, right? So you had a lot of permitting beforehand, so it couldn't go up by that much. And Texas cities tend to be smart enough to realize that if you have an unlimited amount of supply outside of Houston of housing, your prices shouldn't go up by that much. Go to the next slide. These are the ones that are not doing as well. Skilled places are towards the top. Less skilled places are towards the bottom. New York looks at the bottom of this list. New Orleans is the one place that did worst. In general, wage growth is associated with skills. Employment growth is associated with warmth in these areas. Other thing to notice, and again, this highlights the thing that I got most wrong about what would happen in the economy during COVID, what is the combination of robust wage growth with striking employment declines. So I thought what would happen from COVID would be a real drop in demand for urban service workers because people wouldn't want to go out to get a latte. I thought maybe there'd be some shock to the number of workers willing to do this stuff, but no. What really has driven this is the Great Resignation, is in fact that people aren't willing to go out and work on these things. And so it's been much more of a labor supply shock than a labor demand shock, which is where you get that telltale combination of employment going down and wages going way up. Okay, now 3 things, and I'll just say in terms of, we've got to be, if cities want to compete, they're going to need to be smarter. They can't just tax their way out of it. In the book, I talk about 4 areas. One of which is, I think, the most obvious, which is crime. That somehow or other America got itself, or some branch of America got itself into a deluded view that the right thing to do about crime was just to shut down the police. That's just nuts, okay? And as much as I may be an aficionado of policing reform, and certainly sentencing reform, right? I tell the story in the book about Ida Balaciotes and the fight to get 3 strikes and you're out, which was based on her daughter, who was horribly slaughtered by a repeat sexual predator who should never have been on the streets. Right? But the system should be able to lock up Diane Balaciotes' killer for life, but not lock up every 3-term drug dealer. Right? You should be able to figure out some sensible combination that actually punishes the people who should be punished and not others. I'm actually hopeful about being able to, if you spend a little more on crime, of actually able to deal with both objectives in policing, which is treating every resident with respect and reducing crime. You just need to measure, right? It's Drucker's old mantra, what gets measured gets managed. You just need to measure citizen respect just as we measure crime. Citizen enjoyment, citizen pleasure with the police. Housing supply, I've talked about housing supply a lot. In my life, I think the answer is fairly simple economically, but just murder politically, which is we just need to permit more housing, right? We got lots of land in this country, and we got lots of land in most of our cities. We've just got to permit more housing. That's what delivers the answer to this. The harder one, and I will just end with this, is education is absolutely central. And I spent 10 years on the advisory panel of the Gates Foundation, its domestic branch, thinking about education reform. And there were so many moments of hopefulness and so many moments of sort of thinking that we have some kind of an answer. And we just have made very little progress with in the past 20 years, 2 big national things, No Child Left Behind and the Race to the Top program, right? Both of which were well thought out, were clever, neither of which moved the needle in a really major way. I'm very skeptical actually about anything that the feds can do that will shape local school districts. I think basically this is a local matter. But I still think we have an obligation to do more for our kids, particularly for our high poverty kids. I like the idea of doing more things that are experimental, particularly vocational training, that wraps around existing schools, that leaves the existing school as in the ownership of localities, but then funds things that are competitively provided. And the great thing about vocational training as opposed to traditional K through 12 is you can pay for performance because you know whether or not someone's learned how to become a plumber or a programmer at the point of delivery. So we can have lots of people compete to do this, private sector, unions, any other group who wants to be in it, but you pay for performance. And with that, I'll end it up. But thank you all for being here, and it's great to be part of this conversation with you.
All right, so now comes Q&A. So I'm going to moderate this session. Please look for Melissa, Noah. If you have questions, write them down on the card, hand them in, and they'll get them up to me. But just one question to start off. Is remote work really bad for cities, or is it just bad for downtowns? And that what you're actually going to get is more mixed use, more 24/7 downtowns, the sort of outer neighborhoods become more lively. Is that altogether bad?
It's not altogether bad. And look, I think by and large, remote work is a blessing. I think by and large, things that increase people's opportunity sets are actually good things. So I don't think of this as some sort of great curse, although I will say, if I have to take another administrative meeting via Zoom, I may shoot myself. But but basically, this is a positive thing. And I think you're right. But let's just highlight what you were saying. Okay, to have more mixed use downtown, you need to have the permitting freedom to do it, right? And this is an era in which both because we need to sort of restart various forms of the urban entertainment economy, and because we need to reuse or these buildings, we need to make sure that we have permitting that's permissive enough to actually enable the changes that cities need to make.
Have cities always been, haven't they always been population sinks? One of the questions here is kids in cities. What makes cities a family-friendly city? Is that going to be a challenge kind of going forward? We're seeing a lot of household formation over the past year or so. What will make places, what will make cities today places where people want to live and raise a family?
So there are 2 things, one of which is, neither of which is sort of, unsolvable. There are 2 things that traditionally make cities, tougher kids, one of which is the school systems. And this is entirely, America's own decision. We've decided to tie the quality of education to where you live, and we created a system where lots of parents decided to leave cities. Lots of wealthier parents decided to leave cities in the 1960s and 1970s, partially because they were able to afford a car during those years. But this is not natural, right? There's no sense in which any Frenchmen thought they needed to leave Paris to get better schools for their kids. No Englishman ever thought he had to vacate London to get better school for their kids. This is an American thing that we've designed, and we can change. And you could change, oddly, if you wanted to move to sort of a dirigiste French model, which says it's 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon and I know what every third grader in America is being taught. I'm not in favor of that model, but you could go in that model, which would create uniformity of some form. Or you could move towards a more market-oriented model. It says it doesn't matter where you live. You have access to a vibrant competition among charter schools that actually enables you to get the same school anywhere. Either of those models would work.
So does remote work, one of the other questions is, does remote work make state and local taxes more important or less important? Similar question, another one was on amenities. So if you look at reasons why people are moving, they're moving for perhaps more policy-oriented reasons, rather than just, New York is a gusher of cash and there's a bunch of good jobs in San Francisco.
We haven't seen the data, but I would be shocked if you didn't have, more sensitivity to wasteful taxes. I mean, I think it's always important in terms of state and local taxes to keep in mind that, if the state and local taxes are paying for stuff that people value, they're not going to necessarily scare people off, especially if they're, administered in a relatively fair fashion. The problem is if we decide we're going to run a local safety net where we massively take from rich people and give to poor people, not every rich person thinks they want to necessarily do that when there are options that have, let's say, state bans on income taxes. So I think it does become more important, but it shouldn't necessarily lead us to think that we want to shrink every aspect of local government. We just want to make sure that we're getting value for our dollar.
So speaking of dollars and cents, we have a very strong Towns-esque question here. It's from Chuck Marone, so this makes sense. So a lot of financialization and debt, he says, helped get a lot of office space built. To what extent does it now impair the price corrections that need to happen? There's a lot at stake.
Oh, you want to be in the weeds on this? Okay, let's do it. Okay, now I can't tell you the full quantitative number on this, but one of the things that we've been watching is, Michael, I know you're fully aware of this, is there's been a shock to ground floor retail that long predates this pandemic, right? And there have been now empty storefronts in the Upper East Side of Manhattan for many, many years. Economics says that shouldn't happen. Economics says that those rents should come down and that those spaces should get occupied. What's holding it back? Now, one hypothesis is that what's holding it back is the nature of the debt covenants. So many of these debt covenants mean that you're actually not allowed to cut your rents, okay, which naturally would explain why these things are sitting open for a long time. So I think we need to think whether or not there are other elements of the debt contracts for, let's say, larger forms of commercial space that will also impede the working of the price mechanism. Just as we worried during the Great Recession about various aspects of the debt covenants on the residential mortgages and how they could be making it difficult for that market to sort itself out. But it's a great question.
So there's two questions on smaller cities and rural areas. Is there an opportunity now to better connect thriving cities with their rural areas or other small cities around them? Is remote work part of that? How do you do that? Any thoughts? So
for sure, remote work makes it easier to dial in from a distant area. It doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the same. I think when I think about which low density areas are going to benefit from this stuff, remember that remote work, remember that fact about who worked remotely in May 2020, right? It's skilled people, which means that remote places that are attractive to skilled people are very likely to benefit from this. And when you go down, I just gave you the 50 largest metropolitan areas. When you go down to the littler areas, the places that really did well during the last 2 years, there were places that were college towns. There were places that had attracted skilled people for decades before this. They had amenities that skilled people want. They were basically nice places. This doesn't mean that a low-density part of America that is not particularly attractive, that has no amenities for skilled people, will not necessarily benefit for this. And I see very little of this which is likely to benefit the Rust Belt cities, which have had problems for decades either.
So you said, going to housing, there's a question on a quote that you had. You said there's plenty of land. What does that mean in California? What's the California context for plenty of land, wildfire risk? What should building look like here in California?
That's a great question. I think the fact, and I'm not sure if it's still true, but the fact and I wasn't building up all the infrastructure that you needed, but just as a sheer accounting sense, you could put the whole world on 10th-acre lots in the state of Texas, right? Just in terms of just the adding up of just how big America is. So this is a question in California, right, about how compact. Now, first of all, like, look out there. There's a lot of empty stuff, right? We look around, there's a lot of empty stuff everywhere. The question is, what does it mean to permit more stuff in California? And I think the right answer is probably not to sort of, have things further and further out in the exurbs, but to allow more intense building in LA County, in Orange County, in places that are, central, but where zoning has made it very difficult to add space. And again, I'm not arguing for that anyone should live in a denser area than they want to have. I think that one of the greatnesses about America is we have lots of different ways in which you can live, lots of different communities, lots of different cities, lots of different structures, right? Many people may want to live in a place with 2 acres, but I'm a little bit less confident that they have a right to impose that all their neighbors have to have 2-acre lots as well. And that's sort of at least the way that I've always viewed a lot of local zoning. Is it's a taking of private freedom from individual landowners and making it impossible for them to do with their land what they would choose to do with it.
So you said that there's a lot of land out here. The California Coastal Commission would have something to say about developing that land. So that leads to one of the other questions, which is how should city leaders react to bad state policy that restricts their ability to compete in the areas that you've highlighted?
Right. So California is just in its own world in terms of the land use planning. I mean, it's sort of just amazing. I mean, from the Friends of Mammoth case on down, which requires sort of every large local project to go through an environmental impact review, and it's an environmental impact review that's completely slanted, right? That takes only into account what happens in the very hyper-local environment and doesn't incorporate at all the fact that building in California is just intrinsically green because this is a very mild climate, and so that means you need much less, heating in winter and much less air conditioning in the summer. And when you don't build in California, you build somewhere else. You build outside of Las Vegas. You build in Texas. You build in a place that is intrinsically less green, not because of anything about California's policies, but just because it's a heck of a lot more humid in July in Texas than it's going to be in San Francisco. And so, in terms of fixing California, I don't know, Michael. I mean, look, we see these things.
We have a panel right after this where we
see these things come through. Look, every time I'm always on the YIMBY side on this, and every time we see something that comes out of the state legislature that's sort of vaguely in favor of easier permitting for somebody, I cheer. But this is small potatoes, right?
Okay,
so it's hard to imagine that it's going to make a huge difference, but I'm certainly still rooting for it.
There's a related question. I just happen to really like this subject matter. Does rent control ever make sense? I thought I'd ask an economist this.
Okay, the only times in which I think you can make a case for it was during World War II itself. Okay, where there are sort of morale issues with people seeming to get excessive profits out of wartime shortages. Now, that by doing this, you're still screwing up the housing market, but it may make sense to do this for psychological reasons that are completely unrelated to actually helping the housing market function. If you're not in a situation in which you're asking Americans to sacrifice an enormous amount to fight for freedom across the oceans, then it doesn't make sense, right? And it doesn't make sense for many, many reasons. It doesn't make sense because it screws up the incentive to supply more housing. It creates the incentive to take housing off the housing market, off the rental market, and put it into the ownership market. It doesn't make sense because it means that owners don't have an incentive to maintain their housing. And the work of David Otter and Parag Pathak in Cambridge shows not only does your own apartment diminish if you're under rent control, but your neighbor's apartments get crappier too, because nobody wants to maintain a house that's next to a crappy other house. It screws up who lives in the houses. One of my favorite quotes on this is from Nat Sherman, the famous tobacconist to the world, who, when in a quote that's cited in The Streets Were Paved with Gold, which is about New York in the 1970s, he says, yeah, I have this, dirt cheap apartment overlooking Central Park West, but it's fair because I use it so rarely. It's fair because I use it so rarely, which means that he's getting almost no value out of this. Well, the problem is there are people who would pay 5 times as much as he would to get this thing, and because of rent control, they're not getting it. And this quite wealthy person gets this extra little vacation pied-à-terre, right, instead of it going to the people who value it most. So no, I think it's. I think it is clearly, about as unwise a policy as we can have. I will just end by quoting the words of Assar Lindbeck, a distinguished Swedish social democratic economist who declared that short of bombing, we know of no faster way to destroy a city than rent control.
The socialist economist, Swedish.
He's on the margin.
Democrat.
I mean, you wouldn't want to,
Okay. All right. So, but by the way, I love all these different questions, a variety of topics, and that you can tackle all this huge variety. Here's another quick shift. Disasters impact in the degree of, like, how do they affect the strength of civil societies? You brought that up. What role do local leaders play in fostering local strength, local civil society?
Absolutely. It's on you. Absolutely. Local leaders have a huge role to play in this. I mean, good mayors know their people, make their people feel that they're respected, make change feel comfortable. Right? So I was a big fan of Mayor Menino, who was a 5-term mayor in Boston. And he knew more than half of the city personally. He knew them. He spoke every time words came out of his mouth. You knew that he was a real Bostonian, right? I mean, you couldn't understand it half the time, but like it was fantastic. And so that credibility meant he could push for an innovation district, which then built towers for tech companies or new entrepreneurs for Boston. And everyone believed that he was doing that for them. Right? Whereas I promise you, if Michael Bloomberg was doing this in New York, everyone would think the fix is in for his tech company buddies. Right? It's all about sort of having that credibility and building that sense of connection so the community trusts you. That is a huge part of local leadership. I would say also one other thing on local leadership, which is sort of my mantra on this, which is that most of the time, capacity is much more important than policy. And this is something that takes a while for people who come from the ivory tower to figure out. That you come in with some brilliant policy idea that you've shown up, and the mayor basically has 3 people who will do what the mayor wants them to do, and he's not going to waste those 3 people's time on your idea. He's got his own stuff to do. And those limitations on what, just the ability to make changes are just really, really important. And it's really important always to pay attention to that.
What have you observed in capacity building in local government? So you're coming in as a mayor, you're trying to get a handle on the issues, you made promises in the campaign trail, and you have your office to deliver on that, but then there's also an entire staff as well, there are professional agencies. What have you observed as lessons learned of how mayors can lead well?
Every place is different, and usually there needs to be some pocket within the city where you can actually find highly skilled workers who will actually do what you say, as opposed to the parts of Boston City Hall that would not turn on their desktop for the first 10 years desktop were around. And it was only when smartphones had the pictures of their grandkids on them that they would be induced to switch over to use their grandchildren's kids. But there are still pockets of City Hall which were willing to do what the mayor said, and you build up those parts, and you have you find your people. I think it's just as interesting though to ask, where does talent come from outside of City Hall? Right? Where do you get aides to help? And often it has to do with a very mayoral specific thing. So I remember doing an event with Mayor Walsh in Boston just as he was beginning his tenure. And it was a sort of town hall, and the people who really staffed this in a functional way were his guys from the trade unions, his guys who were building union guys. And they were stand-up guys, and they showed up at 6 o'clock, and they made sure the thing happened. And they were great. They were absolutely fantastic. And very different model, Columbus, Ohio. I said northernmost Sunbelt town, very pro-business town, partially because the Columbus Partnership for more than 20 years, has stepped up, right, and has provided, business leaders have provided state capacity to mount bids for things, state capacity to rethink downtown. And it's the business community coming together that has provided an enormous amount of strength for that administration that they wouldn't have in-house. And so that's another model, right? There are lots of different ways in which a local leader can gather talent from outside. The key, of course, is the local leader still has to maintain some control over it, but that's why you're here, right? That's why that's why you got your job, so you're presumably good at that. But figuring out how to get more people than the people who are your direct reports to actually do what you want is sort of a critical thing.
Final question on talent. What does it mean for leaders today to attract talent into their communities in an age of remote work, but more than just the top-tier talent that's maybe mobile, but just really inclusively building it within the communities? What does it mean for talent for the future? The cities.
This is such the important question, and I always say that the most important form of economic development, the basic line is what you want to do is attract and retain talent, and then get out of its way, right? It's also most of the time how you build a great university department as well. And that does mean your schools, right, end up being really important, because your schools are going to turn out talent, and they're also going to attract talented parents if they're stronger. But it's also about attracting talent that's not connected to the schools, which is about having amenities that are fun. It's about unleashing the entrepreneurs who can make cities more entertaining. And one of the things that upsets me most about entrepreneurship in this country is the fact that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor so much more than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich. Right? That in fact, if you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, you can have 20 years of influencing the world before any regulator knows you exist. If you want to start a grocery store that sells milk products 2 miles away, you have 15 permits before you can sell a single thing. Okay? That's just appalling. And it's those grocery stores, it's those real world entrepreneurs that actually make the city fun. Right? And they're the ones where it's really important to have things like one-stop permitting or other things that actually just make it easier for ordinary people to start the businesses that bring joy to ordinary urbanites. And that is part of economic development strategy. Because if your city isn't fun, it's not going to win.
And you bring joy to us ordinary urbanites too, Ed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.